I'm going to be painting with Derwent Inktense pans, pencils and blocks in this step-by-step landscape tutorial. Derwent kindly sent me lots of these different materials to try out, so I hope you're going to enjoy what I discovered about using the Inktense products. Let's get started. So I'm starting off using the Derwent Inktense Paint Pan Studio set. There's 24 colours here, and I'm mixing up the ultramarine here and now the navy blue and a little bit of the bright blue, which is like a phthalo blue. I will put alternative colours in the description below. This studio set has the unique Inktense formulation found in Derwent's pencils and block ranges, which I'll be using later in this tutorial. And the paint can be applied without disturbing any previous layers of paint. So I'm mixing up burnt yellow ochre along with fuchsia for the sky. Now I'm using this foam brush, part of their Technique brush set that Derwent sent me to wet the sky area. It says it's really good for wetting large areas, and I was quite sort of interested, and actually the water went on really well, and I quite like the sort of chiseled edge because you can really get into intricate details there and also control the amount of water that you put on the paper. So I'm going to paint the sky wet in wet, starting off with the fuchsia and the yellow ochre wet into wet. And now I'm applying the blue here, wet into wet, tilting my paper. And this is the bright blue, but you could use some of the ultramarine and a little bit more of the pink colour on the horizon. I'm mixing up the navy blue with the fuchsia, taking the excess off of my paper towel and painting some shadows in the clouds, damp into damp. Mixing up a little bit more of the fuchsia and navy blue and painting a stronger tonal value, damp into damp at the top of the sky, both right and left. Mixing up a little bit more navy blue into the fuchsia to make a stronger tonal value, and now I'm tilting to get that colour to blend and mix into the sky. So this set comes with 24 highly light fast Inktense pans and this very handy colour chart. So I thought I'd do a quick swatch of just a few of the colours just to see how vivid they are. And I must say, I mean, the yellow and the orange and the fuchsia here are stunning. I did find the paints dried quickly, and I found a way around this was to work, especially in large areas, on a wet surface, so it gave you more time to paint before it started to dry out, because once it does, it becomes permanent. I found the colours really bright and vibrant. There's a good selection of blues and reds, pinks, greens, yellows, and then earthy colours and greys. So I've got plenty to work with here. I thought this was a beautiful green. It's called Racing Green. And just going to finish off with red oxide, which I thought was a stunning colour as well. And here's a close-up of those colours. They are beautiful, and I'm really inspired to explore the other colours in the set. So I'm actually using some masking fluid to mask out the white waves and light on the cliffs. I'll also be masking out some of the grasses in the foreground. I'm using the rigger that came with the Derwent Technique brush set, the foam brush. Here's the rigger. I'll also be using a fan brush later. The masking fluid has dried, and I'm wetting the sea area with the foam brush. And I'm painting the sea with the sky colours wet into wet, starting off with a little bit of ultramarine mixed with that navy blue, using a touch of the pink mixed with the yellow ochre. I'm actually adding some more yellow ochre here, diluted, painting this wet into the foreground area where I'm going to have those lighter grasses. Adding some of the navy blue here, damp into wet with my size 8 brush. Just where it's darkest under the rocks and on the horizon. I've actually added a little bit more creamier navy blue here, painting this damp into damp again beneath the rocks, just to create a little bit more dark. Inktense dry permanently, and as you can see, I've got a few splashes on the top right hand corner, so I use a damp brush just to wash these away, and it doesn't disturb the underpainting underneath. I thought that was quite a cool thing to share with you. And just adding a little bit more dark here, damp into damp. I've gone even darker in the foreground using that navy blue and the Payne's grey, damp into damp, just to really bring out those darks and softening the hard edges with a clean damp brush. Next, I'm going to be using the Derwent Inktense blocks in my painting. Before I do that, I just thought I'd share with you the colours that come in the set. Also, some of the fun techniques that you can do with the blocks. So I'm using a brush pen here that Derwent sent me, which is quite cool. You pour some water into the little reservoir in the brush, and there's a little button that you squeeze to release the water. As you can see here, the blocks are water soluble, and the colours are highly pigmented, vibrant colours that once dry are permanent. What I loved about them, they were really versatile. You can do lots of different things with them. I'm drawing into damp paint straight from the block here. I'm even blending here with my fingertip using a tea strainer to grate the pigment onto the wet surface, which creates some wonderful textures. And you can also mix the colours together in the little palette here as well. So that pink and blue violet mix here, I paint on the surface and then add a little bit of water from the water brush. Again, using the tea strainer to grate the block here to create texture, drawing into the damp paint. So much fun. And I'm going to combine both the pans and the blocks in this stage using very diluted pinks, yellows and the yellow ochre, all wet in wet with my size 8 round brush. So I've mixed up some of the bark colour into that yellow green and just painting the bottom of the cliff here wet into wet, keeping everything really soft because this cliff is the furthest one away. Adding some of the bright blue here on top of the colours, wet into wet, to sort of make some more blue greens, adding a little bit of that at the bottom of the cliff as well. And I'm using some of that bark colour from the block and tickling on some damp paint to create some darker marks with the rigger, and just adding a few more little details just here and there. On to the next cliff, I'm just painting on a very dilute baked earth with a touch of yellow wet in wet, adding in a little bit of the apple green, which is that lovely bright green. Now I'm using the blocks directly onto the wet paint to create some of the dark textures on the cliffs, and then using a damp brush just to blend and add more colours. So mixing up the baked earth and bark colours here, lovely natural colours, and painting damp into damp. Breaking off a small piece of the block and actually using it to sort of draw directly onto the damp surface there, and then using a clean damp brush to blend and soften those marks. I'm using a little bit of the navy blue to create some dark reflections at the bottom of the cliff. So I'm getting the baked earth block, breaking off a piece and sketching the top of the cliff on dry paper, using a little bit of the apple green, blending and then using a damp brush to blend the colours together. And then painting a very light diluted wash of baked earth, which is light burnt sienna, and then using that small section of the block to sort of sketch onto the surface to create the look of those rugged cliffs. I'm using a little bit of leaf green as well and some yellow, and sort of blending the colours with the blocks on the paper there, creating yummy textures and colours. Adding a little bit of the teal green with my brush, wet into wet, to create the look of the bright green moss on the side of the cliff. And then using a clean damp brush just to blend those colours there, just to sort of almost model the cliff. Now I'm using a little bit of the bark colour. You can use a dark colour here just to sort of paint or draw onto the damp surface, and then using a damp brush to blend those darks. It's quite dark in this corner of the cliff. I'm keeping it light on the right hand side and using my brush just to blend with. And I'm using the rigger to sort of pull some of that dark paint into the lighter paint to create some lovely sort of thin sort of marks, and it's really effective. I'm almost letting my brush dance on this cliff here. And now I'm using my plastic card to swipe the damp paint here and there to create lighter areas, but also to model the cliff, to create those sort of ridges. I'm using some of the bark colour to create darks under the cliffs. Moving on to the cliffs in the foreground with a dilute yellow ochre, wet on dry, using my size 10 round brush. Adding a little bit of the apple green and sun yellow, wet into wet here and there to bring out some of those lovely lime green colours. Using a little bit of the baked earth at the top, wet in wet, just to create some warm sort of green colours there. And I'm using some of the baked earth and leaf green to add some mid and dark colours. Dry into damp, so you can see it creates texture, and I'm using my damp brush here to activate the Inktense colour to create darks and some textures on these cliffs in the foreground. And just using a damp brush to continue blending those darks to create texture and detail. Adding a little bit more green at the top of the cliffs with my brush there, with the baked earth mixed with the apple green. The main thing that surprised me about using the Inktense was the colours dried the same. They didn't dry lighter like watercolours, which I thought could be really helpful, especially for beginners. It can help you judge exactly how light, mid-tone or dark you want a wash without worrying about it changing when it dries. I'm just using my plastic card now to lift off the paint, again to create light and textures and to model these cliffs. It's so much fun to do, and it really does bring these cliffs to life. I thought I'd introduce you to the extra large Inktense blocks, which I'm going to use on this next stage of my painting. Each block contains 8 times the amount of formula used in one of the Inktense pencils. And as you can see here, I'm having fun drawing with them, using them with the blocks and also the tea strainer, and you can use small graters as well. And it creates the lovely textures, and you can use them on dry paper and then activate them to create ink-like transparent washes. I love this bright blue here. As you can see, I'm just drawing into a damp surface, and it creates the most vibrant of colours, and I'm just using that to mix with the red. So I'm going to experiment with these in the foreground of the painting. So starting off with the yellow and the field green. Next, the poppy red. I'm just putting it into some of that navy blue there, then adding yellow. And then adding red to the blue here, and adding some more yellow to make a darker brown. And then adding some yellow here with some red to make an orangey colour. And I'm going to paint this wet on dry in the foreground. And it's great that I've just used 4 colours to get all of these gorgeous colours for the foreground. So adding some of the more earthy tones here and the green, working wet into wet, pushing that green into the sort of earthy yellows. Just mixed up a darker green there with the blue and yellow slightly thicker, and just painting this damp into wet. I'm going to use the Derwent fan brush to pull out the wet paint in the foreground up into the sea area to create lovely thin grasses. I'm just getting pigment straight from the blocks now, using the damp fan brush with a mixture of the yellow, red and blue, and using the side and the top of the fan brush to create these wonderful textures in the grasses. You can get so much paint out of these blocks. So I'm mixing up the yellow and the white here to spatter some light yellow flowers, masking the rest of the painting with the paper towel. I'm just adding some shadows to the cliffs and the sea using the bright blue and black here, using the Derwent rigger to create some lovely dark details here in the water and at the bottom of the cliffs. So I think it's a good idea now to allow my painting to dry. Once it's dry, I'm using the Derwent Artist Eraser to actually remove the masking fluid, and it does a really good job. So next I'm going to use the Derwent Inktense pencils, and I thought it'd be fun to do a colour swatch of most of the colours here. I picked out my favourites. I must admit the colours are so vibrant and beautiful. Loved working with a dry pencil into a damp wash as well. It was buttery, and the sort of colours were so strong, much stronger than any other watercolour pencils I've used before. So I was quite excited to use them in the painting. So this is on the dry painting using a dark blue, and it does create some lovely textures. Quite nice if you want that as well in your painting, because it picks up the tooth of the paper, and I'm using very rough paper here. So I'm adding some of this dark blue to the sea as well. And where I'd removed the masking fluid, I'm just adding some of the Inktense pencils here and there just to soften the hard edges left by the masking fluid. And I'm just using some yellow here to draw and sketch at the top of the cliffs and on the cliff face here and there. And it's actually quite nice to work with them on the dry surface. They're really quite creamy almost. It gives you a lot of pigment. I've decided to use the water brush here to activate that dark blue and just to blend underneath the cliffs where it's darkest. Going back to the pans and spattering some red oxide and some of the sun yellow mixed with the burnt yellow ochre. And I'm finishing off this stage with a few birds in the sky, and I'm going to allow my painting to dry once more. And I'm finishing off with some white gouache wet on dry with my size 4 brush to create light and detail. This is especially helpful if you haven't used masking fluid. And of course, a little spatter and a few more light grasses to finish my painting. And here is a close-up of the painting. I am so pleased with all the textures and the amazing vibrant colours. I only had to paint one layer in each area of the painting. I didn't feel I needed to build up in layers, which was quite interesting. I could work sort of wet into wet, damp into damp, and then almost wet on dry in places without losing the sort of intensity, and the colours didn't muddy. So that was really interesting for me going forward in my watercolour painting. If you have any questions about the Derwent products that I've used in this tutorial, please put them in the comments section. And if you'd like to purchase any of the materials, check out the unique promotion code in the description below where you will get a discount on Derwent materials. Thank you so much for watching. Happy painting. Bye for now.